Imagine waking up tomorrow and hearing a voice. Not your own thoughts, an actual voice, as clear as someone standing right next to you, except no one is there. You'd probably be frightened, but you'd also know exactly what to do next. You'd tell someone, you'd see a doctor. Somewhere in the back of your mind, you'd already have a word for what might be happening to you. Psychosis, schizophrenia, a diagnosis, a name, a path forward. Now take that exact same experience, the exact same voice, and drop it into a human being 10,000 years ago. There's no diagnosis waiting for them, no word that neatly explains what's happening inside their own skull. And depending on exactly where on the planet they happened to be born, what came next for that person could look almost nothing alike from one village to another. In one place, they might have been handed a role of enormous spiritual importance. In another, someone might have drilled a hole directly into their skull while they were still very much alive. This is the story of what ancient humans actually did when someone went mad, and once you understand it, you'll never hear the word crazy quite the same way again. Let's start with the hole in the head, because it's the oldest hard physical evidence we actually have. The procedure is called trepanation, and it's exactly what it sounds like, cutting or scraping a hole directly into a living person's skull. It sounds like something out of a horror film, but the archaeological record for it is staggering in scale. Archaeologists have recovered trepanned skulls dating back to the Neolithic period, found across Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Americas. In Peru alone, more than 10,000 trepanned skulls have been unearthed, by far the largest concentration found anywhere on Earth. In late 2023, a team led by Professor Handan Üstündağ, excavating at Çatalhöyük in Turkey, uncovered a skull belonging to a young man, roughly 18 or 19 years old, with a precise 2.5 centimeter hole cut into the side of his head. The site dates to approximately 8,500 years ago. Here's the detail that should genuinely surprise you. A huge number of these skulls show clear signs of healing. New bone growth around the edges of the hole, smooth and rounded rather than sharp and fresh. That means the person didn't die on the table. They survived the surgery, sometimes for years afterward, sometimes long enough to be trepanned a second or even a third time in their life. So why would anyone do this on purpose? The honest answer is that trepanation almost certainly served more than one function, and researchers still argue about which purpose applied in which case. Some holes clearly correspond to head trauma, a skull fracture from a club or a fall, where opening the skull would have relieved dangerous pressure on a swelling brain. That part makes practical sense even by modern medical logic. But a significant portion of the evidence points somewhere stranger. Multiple sources on the history of early medicine describe a specific belief running through prehistoric and early historic cultures, that certain conditions, seizures, violent or erratic behavior, what we might now call psychosis or severe mental illness, were caused by something trapped inside the head. An evil spirit, a malevolent force, something that didn't belong there. Drilling a hole gave it a way out, which means somewhere, tens of thousands of years before anyone had a word for psychiatry, a group of humans looked at a person in the middle of a mental health crisis and came to a working theory. Something is inside this person's skull that shouldn't be there. Their solution was brutal by any modern standard. But it wasn't random, and it wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was, as strange as it sounds, an attempt at treatment. Now let's travel to a completely different part of the ancient world, one that dealt with madness in a very different way. Not with a blade, but with a name. In ancient Mesopotamia, the civilizations of Sumer, Babylon, and Assyria, unusual or disturbed behavior wasn't treated as a medical mystery to be diagnosed. It was treated as a targeted attack. Assyrian and Babylonian texts describe specific conditions being attributed to specific supernatural entities, and because hands were symbolically associated with control over a person, many of these conditions were literally named after the hand responsible. The Hand of Ishtar, the Hand of the Ghost. Each affliction had its own presumed cause, and each cause required a differently trained specialist. There were priests who dealt with ghost possession, others who dealt with demonic influence, and others still who handled cases believed to stem from a god's direct punishment. The professional who handled these cases was called an ashipu, part priest, part exorcist, part physician, all at once. An ashipu's job was to work out exactly which entity was responsible, because in Mesopotamian belief, a spirit's power over a person was tied closely to knowledge of its specific name. Get the name right, and you had leverage. Ritual texts describe elaborate ceremonies, incantations recited in careful sequence, protective talismans assembled from materials believed to hold specific power, meteoric iron, tamarisk wood, reeds, flour, animal hair. If a gentler approach failed, the process escalated. Some accounts describe increasingly aggressive tactics meant to make the body such an unpleasant place for the spirit to remain that it would leave on its own. What's easy to miss in all of this is that Mesopotamian healers weren't operating purely on superstition with no attempt at precision. Their system was organized. It categorized symptoms, assigned probable causes, and matched each case to a specific, specialized treatment pathway. It was wrong by the standards of modern neuroscience, but it wasn't careless. It was, in its own framework, systematic. Move a little further along the map, into ancient Egypt, and the theory shifts again. Egyptian medicine didn't locate the mind in the brain the way we do today. It located it in the heart. To the Egyptians, the heart was the seat of thought, memory, personality, and emotion. The organ so central to a person's identity that it was the only one left inside the body during mummification, weighed against a feather in the afterlife to judge the soul itself. So when someone experienced a serious mental disturbance, Egyptian physicians and priests didn't think of it as a brain problem. They thought of it as a spiritual imbalance centered on the heart, something disrupting the core of who a person was. Treatment reflected that belief. Egyptian priests, acting as go-betweens with the divine, performed rituals intended to restore that balance. Amulets worn against the skin, spells recited over the patient, prayers offered on their behalf. But alongside the spiritual side sat something surprisingly close to practices we'd recognize today. Multiple historical accounts describe ancient Egyptian recommendations that patients experiencing mental distress engage in painting, dancing, and attending musical performances, activities meant to lift and stabilize a troubled mind. In Babylon, Assyria, and across the wider Mediterranean world, music specifically was used as a therapeutic tool on the belief that it directly affected emotion. That belief turns out to have been fundamentally correct. Modern art and music therapy exist for essentially the same reason ancient Egyptian priests reached for a lyre 4,000 years ago. But the real turning point, the moment where the story of madness starts to look recognizably medical rather than purely spiritual, happens in ancient Greece. Around 400 BCE, a physician named Hippocrates did something almost nobody before him had seriously attempted. He proposed, in writing, that mental illness had nothing to do with gods, demons, or ghosts at all. In a text addressing epilepsy, a condition long treated as a punishment from the divine, Hippocrates opened with a direct challenge to that entire worldview. He wrote that the condition people called sacred was, in his view, no more divine than any other disease. It had a natural cause. Its supposed sacred origin came from human ignorance, not from the will of the gods. That single reframing is one of the more genuinely radical moments in the history of medicine. Hippocrates argued that the brain, not the heart, not some external spirit, was the actual organ responsible for thought, personality, and mental illness. To explain how it could malfunction, he developed what became known as humoral theory, the idea that the body contained 4 essential fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and that health depended on those fluids staying in balance. An excess or deficiency of any one of them, he argued, could produce physical illness, or, just as easily, mental illness. Under this framework, Hippocratic physicians categorized mental disorders with a level of specificity nobody had attempted before. Mania, marked by excessive excitement, agitation, and sometimes violence, was linked to an excess of yellow bile. Melancholia, literally black bile in Greek, described persistent sadness, anxiety, sleeplessness, and social withdrawal, essentially what we would now call depression, and it was attributed to an excess of black bile pooling in the brain. Phrenitis described a more acute, fever-driven confusion, closer to what modern medicine would call delirium, and Hippocratic physicians were careful to separate it from longer-lasting chronic conditions. An important and surprisingly modern distinction. Because the cause was now framed as physical rather than spiritual, the treatments shifted to match. Hippocratic medicine prescribed dietary changes intended to counter a specific humoral excess, exercise regimens meant to restore overall balance, and adjustments to a patient's daily environment and routine. In more severe cases, physicians turned to bloodletting, intended to physically remove excess humor from the body, and purgatives meant to expel it. And in a detail that echoes directly back to ancient Egypt, Greek and Roman physicians also incorporated music and drama into treatment, believing structured performance could help regulate a disturbed mind. None of Hippocrates' underlying biology holds up today. There is, of course, no black bile organ quietly overproducing sadness, but the shift in framing mattered enormously, because it was the first time an entire medical tradition tried to explain madness using cause and effect inside the body, rather than the intervention of something unseen and external. That single idea, that the brain itself could become disordered through a natural physical process, is the direct ancestor of every psychiatric explanation that came after it, all the way down to the ones sitting in your head right now. But here's where the story takes a genuine turn, one that most documentaries covering this topic skip over entirely. Because while Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Greece were all developing frameworks to explain and, in their own ways, cure what we'd now call mental illness, a completely different tradition was developing elsewhere, one that didn't treat these symptoms as something to be removed at all. In shamanic traditions found across Siberia, parts of Africa, and among many indigenous cultures of the Americas, the onset of what Western psychiatry would immediately classify as psychosis, hallucinations, hearing voices, sudden and dramatic shifts in perception and behavior, was sometimes interpreted not as illness, but as initiation. Anthropological accounts describe shamans being identified through what's often called a spontaneous calling, the sudden, unexplained onset of a severe physical or mental crisis that an experienced elder shaman would recognize not as a disorder to be cured, but as a sign that the spirit world had selected that person for a specific role. West African shaman and author Malidoma Patrice Somé, describing his own Daguerre tradition, put it directly. In the shamanic view, what Western culture calls mental illness can signal the birth of a healer. The person in crisis wasn't broken. They were, in this framework, unusually sensitive to something most people couldn't perceive at all, and that sensitivity, properly guided by someone who had already walked the same path, could be shaped into one of the most respected roles a community had to offer. Crucially, this wasn't treated as something to navigate alone. Trainee shamans were mentored specifically because an unguided crisis of this kind was considered genuinely dangerous, capable of leaving a person permanently lost inside it without the right support. The difference wasn't that the crisis itself was less real or less frightening than what a Mesopotamian priest or a Hippocratic physician was responding to. The difference was entirely in what the community decided that crisis meant, and what role, if any, it opened up for the person living through it. Sit with that for a second because it's the single strangest and most important fact in this entire story. The exact same set of symptoms, hearing things others couldn't hear, perceiving the world in a fundamentally altered way, could get you a hole drilled in your skull in one part of the ancient world, an exorcism performed by a priest reciting the name of a specific hostile spirit in another, a prescription of painting and music and dance in a third, a formal medical diagnosis rooted in bodily fluids in a fourth, and in a fifth. It could mark you as one of the most spiritually significant people your entire community would ever produce. Madness, in other words, was never a single fixed thing that ancient humans everywhere agreed on and simply mistreated out of ignorance. It was a category that got built differently by every culture that encountered it, shaped by whatever framework that culture already had for explaining the parts of human experience that didn't fit neatly into everyday life. Demons where the world was already full of demons, bodily fluids where physicians were already mapping the body systems, a spiritual calling where the boundary between this world and another was already considered thin and permeable. None of these ancient frameworks were right in the way modern neuroscience understands mental illness today, as a product of brain chemistry, genetics, and environment, not evil spirits or an excess of black bile or a summons from the spirit world. But it's worth resisting the easy temptation to look back at all of this and simply feel superior to it. Every one of these approaches, the trepanation, the exorcism, the humoral diet, the shamanic apprenticeship, was a real attempt by real people to make sense of something frightening and poorly understood, using the best tools their worldview had available. And if you're honest about it, a version of that same pattern hasn't fully disappeared. Stigma around mental illness still exists in nearly every modern culture on Earth. People still sometimes reach for a spiritual or moral explanation before a medical one. The framework has changed. The underlying human impulse to explain, to categorize, and to respond to a mind in crisis hasn't gone anywhere at all. So if you had woken up tomorrow morning 10,000 years ago hearing that same voice, the one from the very beginning of this video, your fate wouldn't have depended on what was actually happening inside your head. It would have depended entirely on which patch of the ancient world you happened to be standing on. That's the real story of what ancient humans did when someone went mad. Not one answer. Dozens of them running in parallel across the planet. Each one a different guess at the same impossible question every human society has had to face. What do you do when someone's mind stops working the way everyone else's does? We're still answering that question today. We just have better tools now than a drill and a name for a demon. If you made it this far, you're exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. We make videos like this one every week about ancient human behavior, about the strange and often uncomfortable gap between the world you were built for and the one you actually live in. If that's something you want more of, hit subscribe. It costs you nothing, and it tells the algorithm this kind of storytelling is worth keeping alive.